Hey guys, can you hear me? Hey everyone, and welcome. This is the 16th episode of Awakening from the Meaning Crisis watch party and discussion. This one today is going to be about Christianity and Agape. If you're new to the channel and you're new to what we're doing here, this is a watch party that we do every Monday at 9 a.m. PST, 5 p.m. GMT. Each discussion or each lecture is about an hour, and then we do a discussion that lasts a little over an hour. Right after. We'll take like a short 10-minute intermission and then we'll jump into a video chat using the Zoom. I'll give you guys the link for that after and we can all jump in and chat then. So as always, UV, my partner, is going to be taking notes on this lecture at futurethinkers.org/meaningcrisisnotes. That'll forward you to a Google Doc. And then we'll give you the link shortly after during the intermission. So we'll see you then. Enjoy this one.
Welcome back to Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. So last time we had begun to take a look at the transformation that was occurring in the Eastern Mediterranean around the time of the advent of what was going to become Christianity. Now, of course, this figures upon the person of Jesus of Nazareth, a very controversial figure to say the least. And as I said, I'm not going to endeavor to claim to give the absolute or exhaustive account of this extraordinary individual, but instead I'm going to try and do what I've done before, which is to show how what he did contributed to our understanding of meaning and wisdom, and how that eventually pushed the history that has led to the meaning crisis forward. So we were talking about one of the core messages of Jesus. Jesus seems to have understood himself, or at least those around him, understood him as Kairos. If you remember, that's a turning point in the course of history, because as we spoke before, the Israelites and by this time they were known as the Jews, had developed the psychotechnology of understanding history as a cosmic narrative in which there are crucial turning points, and Jesus saw himself as such a Kairos. Whether or not he saw himself as the Kairos that was known as the Jewish Messiah is again controversial. I don't need that for the purposes of my argument. It seems, though, that he had a sense of himself as deeply participating in the way in which God was directing and involving himself in the course of history. If you remember the model of God we talked about when we talked about the ancient Israelite, the God of the Exodus is a God who is creating into an open future, and that human beings participate in that creation by identifying with a particular course, da'ath, loving it, being shaped by it, as well as shaping, participating in its flow. And Jesus of Nazareth saw himself as having an especially deep participation, such that he felt himself to be at one with this God who is capable of altering the course of history and redeeming human beings. He seems to have understood this, Kairos, as having something to do with a profound way of understanding the participation in God, which we've talked about before, makes sense. We've talked about how this participatory knowing is a process in which you're coupled, right? You're neither making it or being made by it, but it's this reciprocal revelation in which you are making it and it is making you. The way you participate in your culture, the way you participate in your language, the way you participate in history. And you know this not by gathering beliefs, but the way in which yourself is fundamentally transformed. And so Jesus understood this participation, his participation in God as the disclosing of this profound kind of love. And we began talking about this, the kinds of love that human beings experience, and how love is something that deeply transforms who we are and our salience, landscape, our character. We talked about the Greeks have three terms, and it's helpful because by this time the New Testament is being written in Greek. It's helpful to understand these Greek terms. So there's eros, which is the love of being one with something, right? And it can be just, drinking water, so I become one with it. But of course it could become what has become more commonly known as becoming one with someone through sexual union, erotic love. Then there's philia, that's at the core of philosophia. This is the love that is born out of, cooperation. So eros is consumptive, making one with. Philia is cooperation. We work together. And a lot of how we succeed as human beings is the way we work together. But Jesus starts to emphasize a new kind of love, agape. And this is not the love of consumption or cooperation. This is the love of creation. It's the love that God is demonstrating towards humanity in the way God is an ongoing creation of the open future. So God is creating the future. He's creating the historical process and course of that history that makes people possible. See, agape is the kind of love that creates persons. So the main metaphor for agape, if you remember, is the way a parent loves a child. You don't love a child because you want to consume it in some way. That's hideous and vicious. You don't love your child when you bring it home from the hospital because it's a great friend to you, it can cooperate. It can't do that at all. In fact, it's not even a person. It's not a morally, rationally reflective agent. In fact, it's exactly the opposite. You love it precisely because by loving that non-person, you turn it into a person. This is the powerful, creative, it's a godlike ability that we have. By participating through love in another being, we can transform that being from a non-person into a person. A person that could enter into a community of persons and find meaning, fellowship, belonging. So that radical transformative power of agape, its ability to radically transform us and reorient us, brings about a metanoia, a radical turning. This means above and beyond, and this means your salience landscaping, how you are fundamentally, perspectively knowing the world. So metanoia, I'm fundamentally turning, altering my whole field of consciousness, altering my whole orientation. And what's fundamentally happening in the metanoia, right, of agape is I'm having a personal Kairos. My personal course is being radically transformed. So Jesus is not only teaching this, he's exemplifying it. He experiences himself as a Kairos, and he's giving to people through agape the possibility of experiencing their own personal Kairos. See, what happens in the experience that Jesus is pointing to, I believe, is we get a fundamental reorientation. For a very long time, we are born out of, we are the receivers of agape. It is only because you as an animal, because that's what you are before you're a person, a biological animal, it's only because you as an animal received the agapic love of others that you were actually transformed into a person. And what you actually do, right, is you internalize other people and how they are aware of you. And that is how you gain your reflective rationality. That is how you gain your own understanding. You fundamentally gain your self-understanding, your sense of self, and your ability to reflect on yourself by how you are reflected through other people. It's a fundamental thing to say, and because it is so fundamental and we can say it with few words, it can be trivialized. But we are, in a very deep sense, born out of an agapic love that precedes us. It's because of agape, because of the way other people have devoted themselves and participated in you, that you went from a non-person into a person, that you got the ability, it's almost like other people are mirrors through which you come to see and realize yourself, that you got a sense of self, that you got the ability to reflect on yourself, that you got a sense of your own ownership. There's nothing that, in fact, is more transformative for an adult than having a child. So from the child's perspective, what's happening is, right, they are, in a sense, consuming the love that the adult is giving them. They're taking in this love and they are becoming one with it. You understand yourself and can reflect on yourself because of the way you have internalized other people's attention on you. But that's the child's perspective. So you can see for the child it's very egocentric. And Freud picked up on this, but I think he also twisted it. In this sense, it's our relationship to our parents, and please listen to this very carefully, is in that sense erotic, right? In the sense that we are consuming them. We are internalizing them. We are becoming one with them. Now, I don't mean erotic in the sense that Freud ultimately meant, because Freud thought that all of that was always a sexual experience. I think that's too simplistic. But I think there is insight here. But take a look at this from the parent's perspective. From the parent's perspective, the person giving agape, it is not egocentric at all. In fact, there is nothing that will more challenge your egocentric orientation, that everything is moving this way, than having a child. If you're a good parent, and of course we all vary in how good we are as parents. I have been privileged to be a parent myself. But what happens is You are no longer the center of your salience landscape. The child is, because the child is absolutely dependent upon you. Do you see? This is the metanoia of agape. I mean, the metaphor is turning, but the problem with that metaphor is all turning is still egocentric. You have to think of the turning this way. The turning is, I go from being egocentric to being centered on someone else. And what I'm actually centered on is I'm centered on the process, right, of creating a person, like God, but not egocentrically, like I'm a God. It's like I am participating in that agapic process that made me. The agape that precedes me flows through me and transforms me as I'm oriented. And what Jesus was offering, I believe, was he was offering a teaching so that all people could experience this, not just individually, personally, with their own parents, but in terms of a relationship to God. We could all experience this fundamental turning such that we become vessels through which agape creates other human beings. So what's going to happen, of course, and you see this in the epistles of John, is the Christian community starts to understand this capacity for radically transforming people so that they become conduits of this God-like creative process whereby non-persons are turned into persons. They're coming to understand agape itself is God. That's what God is. This is so the Israelite notion of God creating the open history becomes, right, it becomes specified in the teachings of Jesus to the idea that, no, God is agape. God is this process that we participate in. And look, it made you. You didn't make it. You participate in agape. It precedes you, it flows through you, and you participate in it insofar as you help other people to come to personhood through you. Now, this is a radical idea. As I mentioned last time, this is going to give the Christians a psychotechnology, a grammar for how to transform perspectival and participatory knowing that is going to allow them to conquer the Roman Empire. I don't mean militarily, of course. What I mean is, what Christians can do is they can offer all the non-persons of the empire a process by which they become persons within a community of persons, enmeshed together in agapic love. So all the women, all the widows, all the sick, all the poor, all the non-male Roman citizens, all the weak, can come to Christianity and receive the opportunity and the community that supports this opportunity of a radical transformation. Now, we know that the community around, there's many different communities around Jesus, I should say. There's, just like around Socrates, there's many different Jesus movements. But this seems to be the key idea. And it seems that it carries with it some kind of notion of a sacrificial element to it. And again, there's a lot of controversy around this, and we have to be careful not to read too much of Paul into this. But we'll talk about Paul in a few minutes. But agape has a sacrificial element to it in that you give yourself, you forgive. You give before the person earns. It's not philia. It is not reciprocity. It is not you and I are working together. You have earned my trust and love. Philia is great and it's important, right? And it's not eros. I love you because of how I can consume you and, right, make you one with me. Now, agape has a sacrificial component to it because what I'm actually doing, right, is I'm giving up. I'm making myself an affordance for your transformation from non-person into person. So this is why Jesus emphasizes forgiveness as central to his message, right? And one of the things we should remember, and this is controversial to say, is Jesus does not anywhere in the Gospels present himself, right, as the means by which, right, we obtain forgiveness from God. He often presents himself as a way and things like that, and we'll talk about that. But when asked how to obtain forgiveness from God, this opportunity of radically transforming ourselves, Jesus' consistent message is by forgiving other people. We experience agape from God, the degree to which we give it to others. And this has been, of course, radically trivialized in our culture, right? We think of forgiveness largely as a matter of, somebody feels sorry and we tell them it's okay. That's not the core idea of forgiveness. The core idea of forgiveness doesn't depend on your contrition. The degree to which you are trying to afford someone else growing into their personhood, and the degree to which you are making a sacrifice towards that, is already forgiveness. Some forgiveness is when somebody has slighted us and the relationship has been damaged, and we have to act agapically in order to reestablish the relationship. But in a very real sense, all agapic love is forgiving love because it is giving before, right, the person that is receiving the love can in any way be said to have earned it. So this idea that we are sacrificially extending the capacity for individuals to redirect their own history, experience their own Kairos, was often captured by Jesus in famous language of being born again. You're dying and you're being born again. This radical transformation of your entire orientation, your entire way of being. Now, the tragedy that befalls the Jesus movements, or at least some of them, because not all the movements care about this. This is, again, something that many people don't realize. There are many elements of the early followers of Jesus, communities that don't care about his death. They only care about his teaching. But, of course, Jesus does die, and that has a profound effect on some of these movements. And again, this is hard to state anything clearly or anything that we could have any great confidence in, but somehow his death exemplifies the sacrificial forgiveness that is at the core of God as agape. Somehow, Jesus' death enables people to internalize that sacrificial love and empowers them to transform other human beings. Now, there, of course, is resistance to the Jesus movement and to Jesus. It's plausible that his death was due to the fact that he was angering and upsetting a lot of people. We see this as as something similar to what confronted Socrates. One of the people that seems to have been an early persecutor is a guy by the name of Saul. Now, Saul's a very interesting person. He's both a Jew and a Roman citizen. At a time when these two groups of people are quite antagonistic towards each other. There had been already wars between the Romans and the Jews. A new one was about to come, two major Jewish revolts. So the relationship is a very tense one, filled with a lot of tension. And this is reflected within this person himself. He seems to have integrated these two disparate and warring aspects of his personality and his identity together around a commitment to law, organized rules of behavior and conduct. And he sees the Jesus movements, the followers of Jesus. They're not, in fact, just to point out something, they're not initially called the followers of Jesus. They're initially called the followers of the way, because Jesus had presented a way. See, the word way is so wonderful because it doesn't just mean method. It's not just some procedures. It's also an affordance of how you're going to move into the future. It is a new orientation. So Jesus is the way in which we can experience the Kairos of Metanoia and become forgiving individuals who are constantly forgiving agapically to others. And Saul seems to see these people, right, and their language of agape and their adoration of Jesus as deeply threatening to his Jewish heritage and also to Roman order. And so he becomes involved in the persecution of the followers of the way. And it's about at the time that he's involved in the persecution that they start being called, actually as an insult, initially Christians, the followers of Christ, what means the anointed one. And so he's involved in persecuting them. He's there, the first time he's mentioned in the Bible, he's there when the first Christian is martyred, Stephen. Stephen is talking about this message, and the crowd gets angered, and they stone him, and Saul basically holds everybody's coats so that they can more effectively stone Stephen to death. So Saul becomes deeply involved in this, and he gets basically a writ, a letter, an official letter to travel to Damascus and round up these so-called Christians and bring them in for prosecution. And on the road, he has what I think we could call a transformative experience. He relates it himself in a couple places. It's also represented third person in the book of Acts, and there's differences in it, as there always is in something that has a mythological element to it. Again, where myth doesn't mean fable, where myth means trying to present a profound pattern. But he's struck by a bright light. And of course, this is the metaphor of enlightenment, and we know that transformative experiences often involve this experience of radical supersalience, often tremendous light, and he is struck to the ground by it. It's an overwhelming experience, and then a voice speaks to him and says, why, Saul, why do you persecute me? And Saul says, who are you, Lord? Lord isn't a title for God. Lord is anyone who has some important higher status than you. And the experience carries with it that ontonormativity that we talked about. Saul has the sense that he's confronting something more real than himself. Who are you? And the voice says, I am Jesus who you persecute. And that's all we need to talk about. I mean, Saul is blinded by this light and encountering this voice. right? And we can think about Plato's metaphor here of as we encounter these things, we're often blinded by the light. But what we need to understand is this engenders in Saul a deep, deep inner conflict. And in fact, when you read his biography, as I've already painted here, you can see that his experience of inner conflict is really profound. And this reminds us, again, it's analogous but different, of Plato's concern with inner conflict, the way inner conflict reveals the psyche. But whereas Plato is going to develop a scientific theory of inner conflict, Saul is going to undergo a transformative experience because of this inner conflict. It is going to riven him to his core, because how can it be that he has had this transformative experience, this awakening experience, this more real from the very being that he was persecuting? How can he reconcile these together? He travels to Antioch, and he actually gets taken in by the very people he was going to persecute. Do you see this? This is this forgiveness. The very people he was going to persecute take him in. So the people that he was going to destroy are actually responsible for his care. And under their care, his sight is restored. What's all this pointing to? Again, it's pointing to, right? He's at war with agape itself, and we all are. Like we all are. We have a very tough time, and this is part of the message of Jesus and John and Paul, at least to my mind. We have a tough time acknowledging the reality of agape. We like to create personal fables of how we are self-made and self-directed and self-secure and self-sustaining. And agape challenges that in a profound way. So Saul goes into the desert to reflect, and this is always a biblical, mythological paradigm for a process of undergoing radical reflection. And when he comes out, he has gone through a radical transformative experience. So he's had this higher state of consciousness, this visionary experience. He then experiences agape from the very people he was persecuting. He goes into the desert, and when he comes back, he's a new person. He's gone through a radical transformative experience, and we know that because he's changed his name. He changed his name from Saul to Paul. And he has a radical message. It's a powerful message. He comes to present agape in one of the most beautiful passages, famous passages in the Bible. You've probably heard it at some point. It's often misread at weddings. People read this passage often at weddings, and they, I think, are misinterpreting it because what Paul's talking about is an agapic spiritual kind of love. Now, there should definitely be that aspect in a romantic relationship, but I don't think romantic relationships typically are understood by most people as venues in which agapic love is the primary focus. Let me read the passage to you. So, Paul begins by saying, "And now I will show you the most excellent way." So, he's showing you the most excellent way. This is, and notice the word excellent, the way in which we can most radically go through transformation and grow. I'll show you the most excellent way. Now, he's not going to make an argument like Plato. Instead, what he's going to do is he's going to present everything from the framework of a participatory kind of knowing. That's how he begins. If I. So he's not making an argument. He's talking about what his very identity, how his identity is being informed and transformed by its conformity to agapic love. If I speak in the tongues of men and angels but have not love, I am only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have faith that can move mountains but have not love, I am nothing. Notice all the language here. This is participatory language. This is the language of knowing by identifying. If I give all I possess to the poor and surrender my body to the flames, because Christians are starting to be burnt, right? But I have not love, I gain nothing. Notice this language here. It's very radical. Love is patient. Love is kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. Now, this, of course, is not romantic love, because romantic love does experience envy and jealousy. It is not proud. It is not rude. It is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. Those are the features you need in order to help and afford someone coming into personhood. Love never fails. Now, we think, what are you talking about? I've been in so many relationships and they fail. That's because you're thinking of this as romantic love. That love does fail. What he means is agape can't fail. We are always born from and always have to give birth to agape, or personhood itself will disappear. But where there are prophecies, they will cease. Where there are tongues, they will be stilled. Where there is knowledge, it will pass away. Now, he's trying to get them to understand, like, what are we talking about here? For we know in part and we prophesy in part. But when perfection comes, perfection here meaning completion, the imperfect disappears. And people, you're like, what? And so he gives a metaphor, one we've seen elsewhere. When I was a child, I talked like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I put childish ways behind me. Okay, so when you're a kid, you have a particular identity, you have a particular salience landscape, right? And things really, really matter to you in a certain way. We talked about this when we talked about Sarfason. When you become an adult, right, your world becomes radically reoriented. What is salient and what is central to you is radically changed. So I hope for many of you as adults, your life is not primarily centered upon and oriented towards the super saliency of candy and toys. If you're, right, really, really oriented towards candies and toys and playing, then of course you're not growing up as an adult. When we go through agape, it is like the change in our salience landscape and our fundamental identity. How we participate in ourselves in the world is fundamentally transformed. And that's what Paul is offering here. Then he says, look, you've got to know what this means. Now we see but a poor reflection as in a mirror. Then we shall see face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I am fully known. And now these three remain, faith, hope, and love, but the greatest of these is love. Okay, so now it's like we're seeing a reflection. We're not in touch with reality. We're like the people in Plato's cave. We're looking at the shadows and the echo. We don't see things as they are. We're not in touch with reality. But with agape, the most excellent way, we will come to know as we are known. Right? He's talking about this participatory love. Think about how when you are and now even use a romantic relationship, one with some significant depth. When you really love someone, how you know them to the degree to which they know you. Right? It is such a participatory way of knowing. You get to be in touch with their reality in a way that somebody else doesn't. That's part of the bargain of a mature understanding of a romantic relationship, right? You give up the extensive erotic pursuit of many different partners in order that you can deeply know and be known by someone else. And that's like growing up. That's like going from being a child to a man. So Paul is actually talking about there's a way of knowing. We're going to come back to this. The term that's being used there is gnosis, that is bound up with agape, this way of loving. See, so all these things, God is agape, we forgive agape, we are forgiven by agape, we know as we are known, we are participating in the becoming a person of others, and then they are participating in ours. It's this powerful, whole new way of being. And it has become so sedimented in our culture and so ossified and so below how we live. It's like the ground we're walking on. And like the ground we walk on, we have contempt for it without realizing how much it holds everything up. I'm not a Christian. I'm not advocating for Christianity. I'm trying to get you to understand how profound an expression of meaning, transcendence, and way to wisdom is being on offer here. Now, there's a dark side to this, I think, and here's where I will probably part company with people who identify as Christians. See, the difficulty with participatory knowing and this gnosis, we'll talk more about this, right? This knowing by participation and going through radical metanoic transformation, right? This gnosis agape that Paul talks so much about. There is a danger with it, right? There's a danger of misunderstanding. So, we have to go carefully here. Look, when I am knowing someone, participatory, agapic relationship, right? My knowing of them and my knowing of myself are deeply, they're inseparably bound together. That's why Jesus will say this relationship he has to God is I and the Father are one. And Paul will say, it's not I who live, but Christ who lives in me. Right? This is knowing by this deep bonding of identity. You know not by transforming your thoughts or even, right, your mind. You know by transforming yourself. But there's a danger to this. The danger is that any aspect of yourself that you do not properly understand, has not come into knowledge, can get projected onto what you love. This is the great danger also in the romantic relationship. Precisely because you are so bound to this person in your identity, a lot of what is unconscious in your identity get projected onto that person. So see, this is why there's such a moral obligation on you when you enter into a romantic relationship to commit yourself to a process of self-knowledge in the Socratic sense, self-discovery, because the degree to which you are self-ignorant is the degree to which that participatory knowing will be darkened and twisted into a projection of aspects of yourself. And I think, to my mind, for all of his astonishing spiritual brilliance, that's also happening in Paul. See, the inner conflict in Paul was very profound. He comes up against the problem that many of us encounter. Aristotle talked about this with acrasia and weakness of the will. We know what we should do, and we do the opposite of what we know is the right thing to do. I know what I should do. It's clear in my mind that this is what I should do, and yet I do this. Somehow, even though knowing what I should do, I find myself almost as if I'm being pulled to do something else. And he describes it, Paul uses the language of like somebody in the midst of a civil war who's standing sort of at the center of their citadel, and the outlying provinces are in revolt. And he experiences this radical inner conflict. There's lots of different theories about what this is, what's he so conflicted about. But Paul comes up with a narrative. Of course it's going to be a narrative, right? He's in the Israelite Jewish tradition. He comes up with a narrative for understanding this conflict. And it's the narrative that comes from a personalization of the notion of the movement from the two worlds as being, right, a liberation from an old place and a movement to a new place, the Exodus. Because Christianity is personalizing this, Paul experiences the Exodus personally. He experiences, there's two of him. There's the old Saul, right, who wants to, right, follow the way of the law, but is actually, right, feels guilty and angry and feels disconnected from God and rejected by God. And then there's the new Paul, the Paul of love, who feels connected. And he sees the old man and the new man. And what's happening is the new man is trying to be born from the old man. And so we have picked, this has become endemic to our culture. This idea of the old me and the new me. We think, oh, this is just natural. I came up with this. Such bullshit we tell ourselves at times. The old me and the new me. Paul understands this, and he understands this tension between the old Saul that was committed to law and order and justice and punishment, and the new Paul who is participating in the liberation of love. And he's trying to understand, why do I have this inner conflict? Because he's personalized the God of history, he understands his inner conflict. And here's where I think the danger of projection is clear. He understands his inner conflict as reflecting an inner conflict in God. God was actually conflicted within himself. It's a radical idea, and we need to know this. Not because, again, I'm trying to advocate for Christianity, because we have to understand Paul in order to understand Augustine and in order to understand Luther. And we have to understand Augustine and Luther if we're going to understand the meaning crisis. So you've got this idea that God has two aspects to him or herself. One part is God represents law and justice and order. And insofar as God represents that, we stand in judgment. We have somehow failed. We have not lived up to the moral perfection that morality demands for us. Look, Kant made a point about this. Morality demands nothing less than perfection from you. You have to be completely honest, you have to be completely courageous, and none of us can ever meet that standard. Now, I mean, we need to balance that with compassion and love. But what Paul is seeing is he's saying, well, God is perfectly just. And therefore we fail to meet that standard, and therefore legally we are condemned to death. But yet, God isn't just a judge, God is also the agapic parent that loves us. And so what he does is he takes the notion that Jesus' death was somehow sacrificial, because we've talked about how sacrifice is born up within agapic love, and he gives it to this idea that Jesus sacrificed himself in order to satisfy God's demand for justice, so that God was capable of freely loving us. Now, and how that redemption model works out, there's all kinds of theological battles about it, and whether or not we should understand it this way or that way is not relevant to our purposes. What's relevant, right, is that within this astonishing foundational message of gnosis and agape, there's also an attempt to project on, this sounds so radical, and I don't mean to make it sound ridiculous. I'm not. I'm trying to be respectful. But the idea that somehow the course of reality itself is enmeshed in a conflict between justice and agape. What that's going to mean is that people that experience deep inner conflict are going to find a welcoming home within the auspices of Christianity. Individuals who are riven by a sense, right, of personal failure, of not living up to what they can and should be, that their personhood has been thwarted. They have not come into a fullness, a perfection, as Paul says, a completeness of their personhood, are going to be deeply attracted to the Christian message. Now, you're probably now seeing how this might be relevant to the meaning crisis. Because what happens if we still, because we are still participating in the waters of Christianity within our culture, even if we're not Christians, and most of us aren't anymore. But how do we tap into all of this? The power of agape, acknowledging its reality, the participatory gnosis, the radical transformation, our own sense of not living up to the fullness of our personhood. What if we still experience all of that, but we do not have the machinery of Christianity with its metaphysics of cosmic redemption available to us? That could be a powerful experience of despair. I mean, Camus famously said, "My whole of my life, I've tried to figure out how can I be a saint without there being a God?" And he, of course, famously came to the conclusion that reality was radically absurd. We'll come back to that. So there is a price we pay. And this is not a statement of resentment, but there's a price we pay for the gifts, to use a Christian word, the grace. That's what grace originally means. The gifts that Christianity has given us. It has given us expectations of love and transformation and growth into personhood and relief from inner conflict. Expectations that I would say are not well met in our post-Christian worldview. So we carry the grammar of God, but we no longer believe any of the things we say with it, for many of us. So what I'd like to do is try and now trace how Christianity, coming out of the Israelite Jewish heritage, and I've already sort of been making allusions of this, starts to intersect with the axial revolution that was coming out of Greece. Because Christianity is going to take up into itself, it's going to take up into itself the Stoicism we've already talked about. Paul quotes Stoicism in the Bible. And as it does that, it's also going to come into some conflict actually, to be honest, but it's going to come into confluence with that strain of the actual revolution spirituality that came out of Greece. It's going to come into connection with Neoplatonism. It's going to come into connection with Gnosticism. So next time what I want to look at is I want to look at the Gnostics, these followers of Jesus, because of course it's controversial to call them Christians, who really center in on this gnosis agape, what they were talking about, and the Neoplatonism, because all of that is going to have an impact on the generation of more orders of meaning. We'll review that again, but if you remember, we talked about how with Aristotle we had developed, right, in the West, a nomological order to meaning, a way in which we could pursue worldview attunement. We're going to see that as Neoplatonism and Christianity come together, we're going to get two more orders of meaning emerging, an order by which we pursue the most excellent way, and an order by which this cosmic narrative history is enmeshed into the Western worldview. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
All right, we're going to take a 9-minute break, and then we'll be back for the discussion. So you guys can go to futurethinkers.org/discuss if you want to participate in the video chat. Please do that now so I can kind of figure out how many people are going to be joining us. Also, I want to encourage you, if you've never participated before, please come in and join us. There's no stupid questions. There's no worries about being kind of feeling not prepared to contribute. We're a welcoming group. So, and this is a good way to get clarity on the lectures as well. So please join us. You can go to futurethinkers.org/discuss, and we'll be back in about 9 minutes. All right. I was muted again. All right, we're live. How's it going, everyone? David, you just love that. That was a good one. I mean, Agape I've never really understood until after having our son. That's been a key change. That was really surprising. How just, yeah, there's no question of duty or patience or anything that was defined as a agape when dealing with him. It's just default. And I didn't notice that before. Like, I've never really done that before, very strongly at least. And that was something I was just thinking about today and yesterday. So it's funny that this came up in the discussion or the lecture.
Yeah. Go ahead, David.
Go ahead. No, that's fine. Go ahead.
I was actually going to point out something else as well that it stood out for me in this lecture, and yeah, the point about agape was really interesting and timely, but also the point about how Paul was so internally conflicted, and he projected that internal conflict onto his idea of God when he talked about this stuff passionately to people, and how this idea became deeply baked into Christianity as we see it today. I thought that was really interesting, and it's interesting also to think from the same perspective how people's own internal stuff got projected and baked into other philosophies and religions. How every philosophy is not something kind of pure and singular that stands on its own. It's a reflection of the person that came up with it.
Yeah, I think that point is beautifully illustrated in this talk, and in a sense, if I back up, it's my experience of watching the whole Vervaeke Meaning Crisis lecture series, right? It is where I had previously read philosophers as parts of truth that are out there somewhere. There's something of the participatory nature of that, recognizing the participatory deep transformation that happens in it, and for each of the philosophers as they're going through that, and that awakening in me, that same thing. It's like it's a very different experience. Suddenly it's like I mentioned in the comments, I'm sort of reeling because it turns my worldview inside out in a way where I'm left more connected and almost speechless in the and the magnitude of that. It's like someone in the comments was talking about Jesus saying everyone is a god, and it's like that is so deeply profound and true, and the projection nature of it is also part of that, right? It's like I want to give an example that happened. I mean, I mentioned in the comments as well that at the end of the thread there that this past week's insights and kind of what I've been going through this past week, viewed that in reflection to what John's talking about in this episode, just kind of blows me away. In my circling practice yesterday, I was facilitating a circle with a small group of people, and there was a moment where two people were really intensely looking at each other saying, if you will stop trying to hear me through your lens, you'll be able to see the real me. And they're kind of both doing that in their own words. And it was such an interesting point of missing, right? And it was like, it just kept going back and forth and kind of infinite nuance of the missing. And I was able to interrupt at one point and just talk to one of them. And I said, this person over here is not your problem. That's good news, because they're not your problem. that's bad news because they're not your problem. It's like, oh my God, this is like, how do I actually be with all of this and not try to make it the problem out there that I'm trying to solve? Um, and that hit me really deeply. And then the other reflection that I've had for the past week is really looking more deeply at the finite and infinite games and really trying to understand that. And there's something really beautiful about noticing that the currency that in a finite game, the currency that I have inside that game is isn't fungible. I can't spend it in the infinite game, right? The currency that comes from that in the infinite game is a whole different currency, right? If I'm playing Monopoly and I win, I can't take my Monopoly money out and go out and buy something with it, right? It does, but I do have insight into who I am that allows me to behave in the world differently than I behaved before playing in that infinite game. And yet playing in that finite game. And yet playing in that finite game, I have to treat it as if it's real in order to get the full benefit of it. And then I think about that and watching this episode, and I think, what a funny notion that I heard Christianity, and I think a lot of people do, but I know for sure I did, heard Christianity as you have to make this finite game instantiation of yourself perfect so that you will be worthy to play the infinite game later on. And it's like, what? No, that's not the point. This is about making the mistakes so that the insight into the infinite game, you can't fail in the infinite game. In the agapic full becoming a person, it is like, that's the transition, that's the point of contact between the finite game and infinite game. Is with agapic love, you that can't fail. It's only from the perspective of the eros love, the consumptive love, that I can fail. And that is in a sense what makes the agapic love possible. It's that affordance between agapic and erotic that allows that whole thing to connect. Anyway, like I said, that sort of blew my mind. I'm still kind of like, what? That so I'm just kind of sitting with that. It's almost too much for me to comprehend.
What you said about the two people in the circling practice stuck with me. About how they were both asking to be seen without projection, and yet not, like, they have this almost, well, it's I guess it's just not a participatory knowing of the process. They know the other person's doing it, but they don't know that they're engaging in the exact same process. It I don't know. That's an interesting thing. It highlights something for me.
Well, and even there is a kind of a sense in which they're saying, I do know that I'm doing it, and I'm going to keep doing it, and I want you to allow me to do that, but I want you to stop.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like, how do we get to the point of granting? Like, the point that I looked at is like, how can you steel man the other person's place, where it's not about, give me my platform first, let me be the one to give you the platform. We're going to get there either way. Let me not be, can I, and maybe I can't find the grace to grant that to you right then, but that says something about me. It doesn't say something about you.
Yeah, could I comment? Hi, guys.
Hey.
I mean, just to jump in right here, it is amazing in a personal relationship where this comes up, this movement from, even eros, and actually what's calling of you quite often in relationship is the philos, this kind of reciprocal, you do this and I do that. But actually the relationship is and I guess because I'm not part of a circling group, this is called upon, and I think what David's also explained is that there's a calling to move to agape. There's a calling to operate on a different level. And whether, I'm amazed at how John has kind of deconstructed Christianity. So for the first time for me, I can see how this movement from either eros, whatever level you're mainly operating at, eros or philos, but this calling to, and I think in higher relation, an aspect of the in relationship, especially in a romantic relationship, we often are calling each other or pushing each other, like, come on, meet me at this love, agape style of love, which is a felt thing, And I feel this in my personal relationship. Like we don't have the language for it. And this is amazing. This is why starting to develop the language to say this is how we operate some of the times, and this is where we could operate, and this is the kind of language that we can use to understand this territory and start moving into higher forms of reciprocal or just love, this unconditional love. I'm amazed. I mean, in a lot of these episodes, how John has deconstructed the cognitive machinery that leads up these transformational processes. And it's interesting listening to you, David, talking about your circling group and how one is in that intimate relationship in a group of people, and what it calls of you. I'm also looking forward to try and establish a group or a group where the dynamics are sort of brought to light and where people are mature enough to use some of this languaging to help navigate through it.
I thought it was really interesting how you talked about agapic love turning a non-person into a person, and how it's necessary, and how we are all results of agapic love that came before us. And by giving it, it simply flows through us. We aren't it. And I remembered as I was listening to that, because this was actually my first time listening to this lecture, I remembered some of the teachers that I've had throughout my life who gave me this kind of attention and, unconditional kind of loving care, and how I was able to develop very quickly with that. And speaking of agape, I gotta take care of this little monkey here. But yeah, I just thought about how necessary it is, how we can't pretend that we're just developing on our own.
Something came up for me that was really interesting and brought insight into something else I've been working on. So I've read through the 3 Jed McKenna books multiple times now, and I've just got midway through the 3rd one, which kind of breaks down the process of what enlightenment is and what adulthood is. And both of them share this one component that I've been very fascinated by, which has been explained a little bit in previous books, but never expanded on until this one, which is the process of becoming enlightened and becoming an adult. There's just more process after becoming an adult. Of the process is basically grab a notebook and write something true. Write what you know to be true. And then look for evidence to disprove what you know to be true. And that's the process. That's everything. He spends 3 books to basically say that. And I've never heard it explained so well And now in context, it makes, with this Vervaeke lecture, it makes so much more sense of, in that we spend so little time dealing with the ego and deconstructing the ego and getting past the ego, that process of looking for evidence to prove our own point wrong, to prove what we already believe wrong, is foreign to us. Like for most people, that's not a thing they want to do, is to deconstruct their own belief systems. But that's such a humbling thing to do. And to me, it's such a key part of real adulthood. And it's why, I mean, that's a piece of why the meaning crisis exists, is because we don't have that willingness to do that kind of deconstruction work. It's just adulthood. It's not even the Enlightenment stuff. It's just like, admit that you don't know everything. Admit that you believe things that aren't true. You know, in the book, he also says there's two types of ignorance. There's the ignorance where you know you don't know something. There's an absence of knowledge. I don't know how to make lasagna, so I'm going to fix that by Googling how to make lasagna. But the second one is when I believe I know something that I simply don't, which is the worst type of ignorance. And that's the type most prevalent, and well, both are prevalent, but the second one is the most dangerous one. I was trying to link this back to the lecture, but I'm going to take a pause here because I'm going to have to collect my thoughts on that.
Speaking of Judd McKenna, I actually also have been thinking about this, but I think in this lecture, it had the words that kind of helped me articulate something. So that you can't separate the author from the philosophy. Or it's difficult because the author always projects something into the philosophy, no matter how detached they may be from their identity and how much they might have deconstructed it. They're still operating through the physical apparatus of their body, which operates slightly different from other people's, and so their perspective on things is going to be different. And so I've tried to articulate this a couple times about Judd McKenna's writing, because sometimes people take it as kind of a philosophy and think that if they go through this process, they're going to end up exactly like him. And that's simply not the case, because every person's bodily experience is going to be different, even if they do the exact same process. So the end state, if you will be a bit different, just because we have biological differences. And so, yeah, like even the philosophy that he presents is still filtered through the lens of his experience. So, you're muted.
If you make a statement, grab a notepad and write what is true. And then seek to, I mean, that to me, that's a process, right? And you use the term process as well, or philosophy is what you said. How is that? I mean, that's what the whole trilogy is basically about.
Yeah, that's
how is that filtered through a personality? Like to me, that's like a mathematical equation. Like you can't fuck with 1 + 1 = 2, you know?
Mm-hmm. Because he talks about quite a lot about what his experience is actually like. And some people conflate that with the process.
Right. I see.
To me,
okay.
that's a description of his personality.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah.
I think I've linked it back to Agape. So Agape is that selfless love, and Eros is that transactional love. And it's consumptive, but also transactional. Or am I missing that?
No, philia is reciprocal.
Oh, okay. Well, anyway, there's something interesting about that, not having the humility to recognize your own ignorance, that plays into my understanding of and experience of Agape, where it's like, if I'm not willing to recognize my place, let's say as a parent, where I, like, not only am I driven to agape, it's my responsibility to it as well. You know, I see that in the way people think about parenting before they become parents. It's like, I have to give up my nightlife, I have to give up my social life, and it's like that kind of consumptive view of love that I think you transition from after becoming a parent. And yeah, there's something to do with that, not doing the work of figuring out how little you know and where you're ignorant, that relates to an inability to participate in agape. I think that's what I'm trying to link here.
Yeah. And also related to what you were talking about before, deconstructing your identity. If your identity is very, very strong and you're really attached to certain things about your life and you identify with them, when you become a parent, it can be very difficult because those things may no longer be viable or may no longer be true about you. So, yeah, I can see how this process of deconstructing identity and becoming an adult in that sense, in the Jed McKenna sense, is related to the ability to give agape. Because if you don't let go of the ego and the identity, then it's very difficult to really give agape.
Along with the personal desires, but the reason I brought up the right what is true thing, because it's one of the first steps to recognizing your own attachments and desires. And I mean, to know something is true and then to find out it isn't true is to recognize that you had an early confirmation, likely born out of a desire for certainty or a desire to be right or a desire to consume that thing, you know?
There's something really beautiful about this. I can't remember if John's talked about this in previous lectures to this or if it comes after this, but the notion of really noticing the lens that I'm looking through. And what I'm hearing you talk about right now with Jed McKenna and the process of writing it down is looking at the lenses through which I'm looking at the world and then putting them back on and noticing, oh, I've got smudges on here. There are things that are blocking me from seeing reality because I believed this was part of the world, and it's, oh, this is part of me. Clean that, put it back on. Now look at the world again. It's like, oh, now I see more clearly, and then come at it again. Wait a minute. Oh no, that's still part of me, right? There's something really beautiful about this too. The notion that you spoke of the responsibility to do this is so there's something, I heard that, and I may not have heard the rest of what you said because my mind went immediately to my own notion of what responsibility means, you know, and I really have looked at it, at both of these things. Responsibility in the common parlance, the way that we use it, instantiates a part of obligation. We're obligated morally to do something. And it's distinct from responsive to, I'm actually in this moment, just responding fully, freshly, right here now to what is happening. And it's an interesting notion that I think gets confused in agapic love, right? So there's so that's an interesting notion just in itself. But I think this is back to what we're talking about here, the philia, the part of this being, in some sense, a community. And it's what kind of gets awoken up in that. This, it's interesting to think of transactional and the, what was the preferred term that you
Consumptive.
mentioned? No, consumptive is the eros, but in the philia, it's transactive, but also
Reciprocal.
Reciprocal. Yeah, reciprocal. So there's something like encircling. It's a reciprocal relationship. We're both in this. And in that, I can't keep my projections out of it, right? I'm kind of in the moment, sort of looking at you through my glasses and seeing you as that. The projection becomes so much what's happening out there, and I'm lost. And can I take my glasses off? And it's like I can't take my glasses off because I'm dependent on these in order to make sense of the world. And it's like, oh, that graspingness is kind of the eros consumptive. Give me so I can see. And if I can give myself and this philia and generate the courage to go to agapic, I see, it's me.
Yeah, I can
Oh,
still see.
it's so it's interesting because someone in the comment thread on the video was saying, is the transition from eros to agape smooth or jumpy, right? And I'd say definitely jumpy in the beginning, almost impossible for it not to be jumpy, and this kind of boom, again, like in Inside Out, and when the world comes collapsing down, oh my God, that is not a smooth transition. But over time, it sort of does become, through the practices that Jed McKenna talks about, in all of this, there is something of it becomes gradually more continuous, right? It still can be jumps in it, but the jumps are less surprising and more like in the moment. It's it's kind of like learning to drive a stick shift. In the beginning, you can't help it being jerky, but after a while you learn, oh, and the shift of all of this, yes, I'm learning how to shift that perspective more fluidly, and it doesn't have the jarring aspect of a new world suddenly thrust upon me, right?
It's interesting also, I'm thinking about how it seems that some people who were not given enough agape when they were children are unable to make that transition, and they become addicted to the attention of others. And they're kind of, like they get stuck in almost this addictive behavior of constantly seeking validation. And how when you're little, it seems that the amount of attention, I don't know, I'm kind of not sure about this part, but it seems that the amount of attention that you receive kind of creates an impression of what the world is like, and children probably operate on that unconsciously. Pay attention to me, Mom. And yeah, so the children who were not given enough attention get grown up with the idea that there's a lack of attention, and they overcompensate into adulthood, and it can actually prevent them from being able to give love.
Good demo as well.
There's something else here. It's all related. It's a little bit heady, and I'm going to trust that we can go here for a moment, because it really is a beautiful thing as well, which is in in the analogy of two bodies orbiting each other, the moon and the earth orbiting each other, there is a reciprocal relationship in the way that they're balanced, the way that they're influencing each other, and there's a wholeness in that. There's an interesting notion in gravitational mechanics, which is the notion of a Lagrange point. And the Lagrange point is the specific place where the orbits of the two bodies equal out, where you're in between. You can stay in one spot and rest there between the two bodies. One of the things that's interesting about that I didn't really realize is from that Lagrange point, it takes just a minimal amount of effort to stay in that point. It's like you can rest there. It also takes a minimal amount of effort to get to any orbit around either body. You can, from that point, have almost infinite flexibility with the right intentional focus on that. So you can change the relationship from that point, and you can change the orbit around that. That doesn't necessarily mean that you get the full embodiment of it. So I can do a tiny impulse to move in a direction, and that's going to then shift me, so I have less and less control over the events, right? It's a moment where my intention and my action can change events very drastically. And now the events are kind of set on a pace, right? And I have less and less input on the specific trajectory of that thing until it comes back around. But I also have, but I, it's too big. It's so that notion, just that piece of it, that Lagrange point has access to many paths, is an interesting one. When I think about that, and it occurs to me, in orbital mechanics, they're limited, but in relational dynamics, there are many more analogs to the Lagrange points, right? There are many points where we could change our mind and change the relationship. I could go from eros to agape or philia in a choice if I'm really practiced in doing that. There are multiple orbits, right? And I can choose in this orbit how am I, where am I? What am I grasping onto? Where am I gravitationally pulled to? And how can I let go of my attachment to that being a certain way? So there is a way that I can look at that flow as a participatory thing, but it requires an awareness and a feedback of noticing that how I'm going moment to moment in that flow. The part about that really kind of surprises me, that there's something in this that's it occurred to me that animals before human beings respond to seasons and their estrus cycles for mating. And human beings have kind of escaped that thing. We have opened up more variability in when we have children and how we choose our lives. And in some sense, that opening up is initially a kind of an innocent opening up, right? The kind of it's sort of the mature member of a species that doesn't have the consciousness that we do is living according to some patterns in the environment. We have the capacity to break from those patterns and live in a different way. But the learning how to deal with the magnitude of the choices that comes with that opening means that we're in a prolonged period of a pre-adult way of, how do I deal with this? How do I actually, that's a lot of responsibility to deal with all of the choices that can come and all of this stuff. And in a way, it's a second order, it brings a second order natural evolution. So this is kind of meta evolution, where we come to points like the axial age and like right now in the meaning crisis, where the point of, oh, awareness, deepening insight isn't just an individual process of like a Jed McKenna, let me journal, but it's like the world is providing the stage for you to, for multiple people to have this insight, right? It's almost easier to recognize, oh, wait, we're all, I mean, you look around and it's like, oh my God, everybody is using different lenses. So much so, my individual conception of the world is so drastically incompatible with your conception of the universe that it was a wonder that we could ever fool ourselves into thinking that there was one objective reality that we were all living to, right? we're moving into the stage where it's like this profusion of like the Lagrange points of our diversity is coming into, like, it's undeniable. And at the same time, if I can recognize, oh, that's always the case, it's just right now undeniable for us as a species. It sort of has this kind of very sacred moment of this meaning crisis is a profound awakening. And at the awakening of it, the confusion around having to let go of what I thought was true, what I thought was solid ground that I was walking on, is is not right. It's not that solid that I thought, and it is something that I can push off of. That was a lot. How did that?
Well, something comes up for me, and I'm not sure how to articulate it, but something to do with the process of taking off the glasses, or let's say, can I say that's ego? The lens you would look at the world, or it relates to ego at least. I think in doing that, it increases the relatability with others and the understanding of the lenses that they wear. But it's like the more on your face the lens is, I think there's a increasing, it becomes harder to understand what the lens of the other is. I don't know. I'm coming from a place of like noticing a deeper understanding in others as I've done more of that ego deconstruction work. I don't know how to articulate it, but that's what I mean.
Here's a part. Yeah, that helps. Thank you. There's something really key about this, which is when you said before, there is the knowing what we know, and there is thinking I know something that I actually don't. Right? That's just the most dangerous. And you know, the four quadrants of that kind of know what I know, and not knowing what I don't know, you know, what I don't know that I don't know. There's something in there that's really interesting, which is what I don't know that I know, right? Where I'm ignorant of my capacity to deal with the world. And in some ways, this process of me doing this lens thing, right? Part of what is in the lens and what culture gives us as this lens, oh, you're all the same. You all kind of operate the same way and everything works out fine. And so part of my delusion, what I think I know that's not true, is that we all operate the same way. The way you see the world is the way
Yes.
the world.
Yeah. Yeah.
And as I cleanse the lens, it's like, oh my God, no, you don't see the world at all the way that I do. And if I'm attached to my way is the way, then the projection is you've got it wrong and I need to fix you.
Yeah.
But if I start to see that, oh wait, no, the fact that I can misperceive this as the way, right, gives me insight to, oh, I don't even know what the way is. I don't know what I know. What, you know, this is then infinitely reflective back onto me. How do I embrace myself and then growing forward in this and embrace you as well?
Yeah.
I jumped kind of quick there. That just to slow down and look at that again. It's that process of, as I look at my lenses and I notice them, there's kind of a shock in how distinct your view of the world is and my view of the world is. And if I really notice that, I can internalize the shock as, I don't know how I perceive the world. I open up to, there are things here that I know that I didn't know that I know.
Yeah.
And that seems to be the aspect of the transformational aspect of this, right? That's kind of the up-leveling. I'm now able to actually embody and be responsive to this wider knowing that allows me to dance in the world differently.
I think it's the kind of superpower that you get from circling. I think that's why circling's such a great practice. Like, you feel, by just quieting your own desires and listening to the other, you feel what they're feeling in your own body in a way that you didn't know you had the ability to do. and that you don't have the ability to do if your ego is running the whole time telling its story of their version.
Yeah, I'm amazed at how like John has brought this Christianity like much more to light as a psychotechnology, but more as a process that works very well at a sort of traditional level of consciousness, and you can quite easily adopt some of these ideas or psychotechnologies without, through faith or just believing. But I think for maybe a lot of us, we need to kind of understand the process of moving from Kairos to Agape through practices like, as you're saying, taking off the lens and going, oh, that's how I see the world. Now I can see that you might be doing something similar, and I can easier let go. And that's one of the practices of deconstructing oneself and realizing that the way that you see the world is just, it's your own personal narrative, and I don't do circling, but I can kind of feel it out in my personal, intimate relationships that the more one holds onto these perspectives at a higher level, the more the other person, perhaps in circling as well, is trying to kind of show you their perspective and break you kind of from this way of seeing the world. And as I was saying earlier, like calling us to kind of step up our relationship to the other and to the world and to everything. I am quite fascinated by the possibility, John has been having this conversation. I haven't listened to the most recent one where, talk about a religion that's not a religion, which is more, from what I understand, is kind of offering the technology stripped of the dogma, stripped of the mythologies, to kind of give us a sets of practices that help us break free from the confines of our identities and ego selves, so that we can, in a sense, become enlightened, let go, and operate at this higher level of love, operate more and more, let's say, from Agape, from this unconditional love that you see in saints and enlightened individuals. And this is what I'm hoping also comes of this process, and I think that it is best done in groups. The same way that a cult would kind of be supporting each other and the ideas. I'm hoping as well that out of these lectures and out of the people that are listening to them is the development of not the way, but ways of letting go of this restricted ego self and opening up to a more not reciprocal, but a more unconditional love towards people in the group, and then of course extending that outward to everybody.
Alexander, your connection's quite choppy at times. I think we got that, but I don't know if it's possible to get closer to a router that might improve.
Yeah, unfortunately, I experienced a lot of power failures, and at the moment we're running on battery, so that might be it. Unfortunately, there's nothing I can do about it.
No problem. There's some conversation in the chat about agape and enlightenment that I find particularly interesting. And I feel there is a misunderstanding of what enlightenment, of how enlightenment might look like agape. Or, you know, when you see someone who claims to be enlightened and the way they act in that kind of all-loving way, I think it can appear to be agape, and in some cases it can be agape, but it's not necessarily. And the way I would say this is like from enlightenment, if you want to take the Jed McKenna definition, which is the one I think is most compelling, is truth realized. And the truth is that the only thing that exists is I am. I know I exist. The only thing I can know to be true is I am. And beyond that, there's just a big question mark. I don't know anything else. But in knowing that I am, and that there are something that connects us all, some I am being, like I am God, let's say, and that other people are God as well. There's this understanding that life is what it is, and I am you and you are me, and we're like, I'm really struggling to say this, but I've got it. Let's just say what would appear to look like agape could be, I understand that we're the same thing, and if you die, it's okay, and if I die, it's okay, and like I'm connected to you. I understand what it is to be, and therefore I understand more of you. But if you die, it would be okay. But while you're here, and the way I interact with you, I can treat you as if you are me. So it's almost like self-love externalized in a way. It's like by knowing yourself, you can know others, but you can have a high degree of apathy, like the highest degree of apathy towards the outcomes of other people's lives. In the same way that you recognize your own death and your own self-destruction is also totally, completely okay. So what I mean to say is, I think enlightenment can look like agape because the way you would interact with anyone else would be as if it was you. You can love them as they are, but you can also be totally callous when they are gone, which to me is not. And you could also not give yourself to them, or give agape to them. I don't know. I think I'm failing at saying this, but is anyone following this at all?
Yeah, I am, and it is a tremendously challenging thing to grasp and to look at. And I want to share a meme that I saw this morning that illustrates the complexity of it. Right? So I want to share this.
Wow.
This is
good synchronicity if you've got something that helps with this.
All right. Most light workers, there is only love and light. You cannot change my mind. And there's something about this which is trying to make agape into, yep, I got agape. It's good. We're all love and light. Everything is beautiful, and the world is burning, right? The other side of this that is interesting is what it evokes for me is the scene in the third Matrix movie when Neo is blinded and said, it's all light. This scene of it, this kind of light worker hippie painting it with a broad brush of enlightenment that disregards the pain, is very distinct from Neo's kind of, oh, I've lost everything and it's okay because it's all the same. It's all made of light. They're two halves of a kind of a coin that is really a challenging aspect.
Yeah.
Of how do I engage with this without becoming attached to this enlightened perspective, right?
Yeah.
Without making it about me.
In short, it's like you can appreciate the specialness of consciousness and the fact that we're all here at this very moment. And you can also believe it's totally okay if an asteroid hits and we all die. You know? It's and there's something in the inaction of like not doing anything if people are suffering because you also believe that to be the right thing. That to me seems counter to what the definition of agape is and why I think there needs to be a distinction between enlightenment and agape. But that image you shared is, yeah, good.
Yeah, I think that notion that that enlightenment means all-time, full-time agape.
Yeah, that's
that's
yeah.
that misses something very key about enlightenment.
Yeah. And then the striving, I mean, the question, I think there was a question, should we strive to be in agape at all times, even though it's, what was it? Even though it may be practically impossible.
I think it is impossible.
Yeah. But I mean, the should we aim to rest in agape? That was the question. But,
I think that's a contradiction in terms, because if a state is a temporary state, by definition, then trying to spend all of your time there is going to be very unnatural and probably unhealthy. And
right, it moves to the having, right? And it's interesting, having mode and being mode here, right? It's like, oh, I should always be in the being mode, never have the having mode. It's like, okay, hold on. It kind of circles back around to the notion of the finite and infinite games as well, right? Those are distinct realms I can't really inhabit at the same time.
There's an additional thing here of someone had a question, Socratic Skeptic had a question for UV. Is it possible to give a child too much attention? What happens then? Which also relates to the another point I was thinking, which is at what point is agape not appropriate in raising a child? Like at what point do you transition into, okay, get out of the nest, be your own person? Because, and is that no longer agape? To recognize the responsibility to make your child responsible for their own lives, to be resilient and self-supporting. Is that not agape, or is that agape? I don't really know.
I think maybe it depends on how we define agape.
I'll take him for a bit so you can chat.
Okay. So this is our first kid, and he's barely 2 months old, so I don't claim to know anything about parenting, but it seems to me that agape is something like giving this little monkey what he needs so that he may become a person. And that changes depending on his stage of development. Like right now, he's an infant and he can't feed himself. He can't change his own diaper. I have to do everything for him. So agape means just completely giving. And, every time he squawks, pick him up and give him attention and try to figure out what he needs. And as he gets older, those needs become more complex, and it's more about teaching him how to take care of his own needs, how to understand his own feelings and go out into the world and more be independent. So, I mean, I don't know if that's the kind of definition of agape that John Vervaeke talks about, but that would be my understanding of it. So
I have an interesting kind of notion about this, right? Something like, when I hear that question, I hear, does agape equal unconditional love? And does unconditional love mean I never criticize, or I never do anything that might shape you? And it's like, from that perspective, no, absolutely not, right? The point isn't to do like what Buddha's father wanted to do, which is to prevent all suffering from his son's life. That's not the point, right? it's really to be as authentically me in relating to you, right? There's something of of agape as I am part of me making giving love that turns you into a person is releasing any attachment to who you become. And yet part of that is in relation to the attachment of who you are, right? There's something of course I want things for you. That's included in me. That's part of how you shape your life. But there is a releasing of that as a it's contradictory, right? I can't give it to you if I just hands off completely and let you do whatever you want. I can't give it to you if I try to prevent any bad thing from happening to you. I can't give it to you by trying to manipulate circumstances of the world so that you develop in the optimal way. I don't know what the optimal way is for you. All I can do is love you fully how you are, and in my imperfection meet with that. Um, and it blows my mind. In some sense, I think agape is useful as a concept, and someone said it came about at a time when it kind of gives this utopic vision, and there's something about it interesting as a concept, but there's also something about it that if we hold on to it as a truth, as something that is real and tangible, and I actually know what it is and know what the boundaries of it are, I think I've lost some of the capacity of it to be useful. I'm relying on something like a propositional knowing of what that means, and it doesn't live there, right? My mind can't instantiate the full embodied experience of that, the full lived experience.
So I guess that in a way answers the question about striving, because you either are acting out of it or you aren't. Striving for it means that it's in the propositional layer, not in the participatory. It's like,
Yeah.
here, funny example. It's like, I really try not to beat my dog. I'm really striving not to beat my dog every day. Well, do you beat your dog? Yeah, I beat my dog every day, but I'm really striving not to.
There's another thought that I wrote down in my own notes at the beginning of this lecture today is I play with this notion of sometimes people say, what would you do if you knew you could not fail? And the thought came up at the point when John was talking about agape is the kind of love that can't fail. And I think there's some part of me that thinks that's the wrong question. It's what do you love so much that you would do it, you would engage in it with a full heart, even if you were guaranteed to fail? There's something about that moves me more deeply, right? It's something that the kind of striving that is there is different than the striving where I worry about the failure of it. I actually engage in it in order to fail. Like I'm actually letting go of a part of myself. And if this is again kind of weird, if I can get into the eros, the consuming that part of the parent's love, this agapic love, that allows me to find my way, to fail and flail. And that is how I become a person, right? Not by being shielded from my pain, not by somebody saying, okay, it's a do-over, it doesn't count anyway. It's not giving somebody infinite Monopoly money to play the game. You're not going to learn anything about the game if you don't have any consequences for your failures, right? Have to learn that, have to actually engage in that, have to let me fail in the striving in order to learn that failure isn't real, the striving isn't real, but I had to engage in it to discover that.
There's something really interesting that this reminds me of. In one of Jordan Peterson's lectures, I can't remember which one, somebody asked him about the difference, between the masculine awakening and feminine awakening. and he used the metaphor of Jesus and Mary as the two archetypes that embody that, you know. So the kind of hero's journey story is the masculine story of awakening, and the feminine awakening, he said, it's more along the lines of agape. It's giving love unconditionally so that you may create a person knowing that they will go into the world and suffer and eventually die, and doing it anyway consciously because it's worthy, because it's worth doing, even though the person that you create will die 100%, because everybody does.
It also is interesting to last week's lecture, or sometime recently, one of the recent ones was somebody was hit by the notion of, oh, wait a minute, the thought of everlasting life in some sort of mortal existence becomes profane. You know, it's like there's something.
It was that, this was me who was amazed by this point, that heaven would be there to teach you to accept death or non-existence. I thought that was profound. Yeah.
Alexander, were you going to speak? It looks like you got unmuted.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I think, and you know, like the story of Paul, Saul becoming Paul, like once one's had that sort of deep illumined experience, and John talks about, you know, that is so true that that is all you want to work towards, you know, that becoming part of your life, or making that more true in the life that you live. And then you kind of spend a lot of time trying to find a way, or a technology, or a set of practices that, you know, help you, you know, become more of that, or also just communicate that so that it becomes part of your community, or part of an integrated life that you live. Yeah, and that's kind of, I mean, that's what has got me so interested in John and others' work on building these sort of like communities. I wouldn't want to say community of practice. You know, when looking back at how this has been quite successfully done through religions, it almost looks like it's calling upon us now to do a, you know, post-rational, post-traditional version of this. And ego, you know, figuring out what makes up the machinery of the self and the ego, and being able to kind of deconstruct it so that we're able to build another kind of vessel. You know, in a religious sense, you can kind of give yourself over to, you know, to the faith, but I think for a lot of us, we can't. You know, we've got to go through a rational area, or a rational set of processes that we arrive at the other side, the sort of on the other side of the simplicity, on the other side of complexity. I don't know, can you guys, is my connection all right?
Yeah. this is actually something that Mike has talked about quite a bit before, using rationality to deconstruct rationality itself, to see that where rationality fails. That
it really relates to what we've already discussed a ton in this call, which is that deconstruction of what you believe to be true. Like because a lot of rationalists are depending upon a framework of truth beliefs. To if this is true, then this must be true, and it just goes on and on. And deconstruction of rationality is the result of a deconstruction of self. Because the deconstruction of self goes with both internal and external beliefs. It's like, I believe this external thing to be true. Here's how I'm wrong. And, list all the ways you might be, that thing might not be true. And that can go just the same for internal. So, and the completion of that process is to deconstruct everything you believe to be true, thereby deconstructing rationality.
Yeah, I think there's something really powerful here about the notion that so this is the thing that's really tricky, right? If we have a thought that rationality will point me to truth, rationality only, right, can the ratio, the splitting, the dividing, it can only disprove something. It can't prove something.
There's only plausible and not true.
Right.
There's no true.
And so the temptation to use rationality to help hold something is like, I have this belief. I want to use rationality to convince you that my belief is worthwhile. Is a corruption of both belief and rationality, right?
Yeah.
The da'ath is the faith, I think. Correct me. Feel free to correct me if I get this wrong, because I still don't know da'ath that well. But when John uses that term, I think it's the faith of that I am moving forward. I'm willing to suffer the consequences in the pursuit of learning and knowing what's happening, right? I don't need, it's not a protected kind of, oh, this is a sacred belief that can't be violated. It's the kind of thing that gives me the gumption to go out and do things, to test it out and find out where can I take off my glasses and see where I'm confused. And there's something really powerful about this whole notion of the way, gosh, it's on the tip of my tongue. I want to pause there. I'll let somebody else hop in for a moment while I regather my thoughts.
Well, I think just related to this last point and related to what's going on in the chat, there was a question by William saying, would you say that beauty, goodness, and justice are branches of agape? And then another question was, would you say that good is a relative perception? So I'm not sure about branches, but yes, I would say all of those things are relative to perception. And then he goes on to say, if one thinks, feels, and acts upon the perception of killing is good, would you say that it's attached to goodness because they believe and live that as good? So yes, I mean, and this relates to the deconstruction process as well. What is good? We all have a moral assumption. Like we all have a moral, a lot of us have a moral belief that killing is bad. But is killing bad? Is bad true? Is good true? And if those are true, is killing one or the other? Like we can't know that. So in a lot of ways, we're making a moral or value judgment about what is good and what is beautiful and what is all of those things based off of our cultural and possibly genetic disposition, which renders it all kind of not culturally obsolete, but in truth, it's obsolete. There is no truth in those things, but it's culturally relevant. But is it like, and that's to say, is good is what is true, good, true, and beautiful? Is that, how do I say that? Is it true? Really, I guess that's as far as I can say it. Is it true?
Yeah, there's something of the, I would say, is it objectively true? And then there's also the subjectively true and then the transjectively true. There's something in the whole aspect of this of how do I engage with that? There's a point here where it's really interesting, that notion of the Lagrange point again, that point where almost anything is possible from this point, depending on how I engage my intention, right? In that moment where I see that, where I see, oh, it looks like goodness is available right here. It's just if I can reach that portal and grab that thing, then we'll have secured good for the rest of eternity. But the moving of it shifts something. It actually changes something. And this is the point where I think we need to be really careful. This is where cultish behavior and where good people, this is where fascism comes from, right? This is the temptation, and I'm getting this in part. I recommend that that anybody who's fascinated with this question listen to the Jim Rutt podcast where he's interviewing Hansi Freinacht about metamodernism, because Jim's perspective has something like he hates postmodernists. Those po-mo bastards always want to just deconstruct everything. They don't want to build anything. They don't care about usefulness. They don't care about utility. And the deconstruction has its own utility in opening up new avenues of exploration, right? And so there's something that if Jim, Jim can kind of call to arms for people like that, right? Someone who sees that oh, we have an opening now to secure and lock down the good for all time. We can live in agape, is a delusional state which can motivate well-intentioned people to act in atrocious ways. And the more intelligent they are, the more likely they can conflate goodness and truth in that way that makes them more dangerous. So it's like this moment in time really, really takes being aware of that and acting with sort of a pureness of intention that doesn't try to grab the ring. This is what Jamie Wheel talks about in the How to Spot a Cult, that grabbing the ring of power, that attempt, I see the good. If you will just let me do it, just trust me and I'll make sure we get to the other side.
Yeah, the what is it? Postmodernists are in an unfinished, are arriving in an unfinished state. They're doing the deconstruction partially, and they're doing it to whatever suits their own ideas of what is good. And in a lot of ways in the culture right now, there's this idea that racism is absolutely bad, aggression is absolutely bad. A lot of different ideas related to this, which arrives at certain types of enemies, and particularly right now, it's kind of the white man, which leads down the same path that fascism has led down in the past, which is why Jordan Peterson has been one of the first to really stand up against that, because he recognizes where that train of thought leads. But to finish my point about the postmodernism being unfinished deconstruction, it's really because they've arrived at something that gels. I mean, they've looked at the world and decided it doesn't work. Things don't work the way I thought they do, or this isn't right, or this isn't the way of things. Let's dive down. Let's break this up. And they stop at the point where it's comfortable, not where it's done. Where it's like they found their in-group and they found the bad guy, and now we can stop here.
This reminded me of a quote by James P. Cars from Finite and Infinite Games that I absolutely love. So here I found the exact quote. And he says, "Evil is never intended as evil. Indeed, the contradiction inherent in all evil is that it originates in the desire to eliminate evil. Evil arises in the honored belief that history can be tidied up, brought to a sensible conclusion. It is evil to act as though the past is bringing us to a specifiable end. It is evil to assume that the past will make sense only if we bring it to an issue we have clearly in view. It is evil for a nation to believe that it is the last best hope on earth. It is evil to think that history is to end with a return to Zion, or with a classless society, or with the Islamification of all living infidels. Your history doesn't belong to me. We live with each other in a common history." So it's a bit of a long quote, but the point is that if we try to eliminate evil, that act in itself is evil.
Yep. I think we might need to wrap up here. We've got a very cranky baby in the background.
My head is like steaming. It's like I need to, I mentioned in the comments somewhere that this one almost could take, this Vervaeke lecture 16 could almost be broken down and have a discussion for each part. It is very, very rich.
Yeah.
Thank you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See you guys next week.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye, guys.